Well, Jim Comey's statements paint a picture of President Trump's conduct that is not politics as usual in Washington, as we heard Jim talk about. But does it break the law? Let's bring in constitutional lawyer Bruce Fein. So, Bruce, at one side of the story, was this inappropriate? Was it political misconduct? On the other side of the story, was there any law broken?
It doesn't have to be a law broken in order to be an impeachable offense. That's basically constitutional wrongdoing that causes the American people to have distrust in the willingness of the president to discharge his oath of office, which includes an obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's one of the chief duties of the president. We have testimony of Mr. Comey that he interpreted the president's statements to tell him, you don't faithfully execute the laws in your investigation of Mr. Flynn. You just dropped the investigation. Now, I was here in 1973 when Archibald Cox, then special prosecutor, was investigating President Richard Nixon. And Archibald Cox was directed by Mr. Nixon to cease seeking presidential tapes and documents, otherwise dropping the investigation. He was fired, and less than a year later, Mr. Nixon was out of office under certainty that he would be impeached and removed otherwise. So if it can be proven that there was, in fact, according to a reasonable interpretation in the circumstances and the words, a directive to Mr. Comey that you either drop the investigation of Mr. Flynn, and Mr. Comey's testimony is he's the only one out of tens of thousands of investigations the FBI had where he was ever asked by the president to drop an investigation. And if he didn't, he could be fired. That certainly would be in impeachment territory. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily, however, that the president could be criminally investigated. The fact is, during the Nixon investigation, the consensus crystallized that an incumbent president cannot be criminally prosecuted because it shut down the executive branch. It's unlike the judicial and legislative branches that have multiple members and still operate if you have one or two under investigation. But a president can't operate. So it's the equivalent of impeachment. But that should be given only to the political branches because you're undoing an election.
There was a question from one of the senators, and this is a direct quote. Do you believe the Russia investigation played a role in you being fired? And Comey said yes, because I've seen the president say so. Talk about the implication here. I mean, Comey really admitting here that he was fired because of the Russia investigation, and perhaps President Trump didn't like the direction it was going in.
Well, I think we don't want to overstate things. We're listening to Mr. Comey's testimony. We don't have the other side yet. You know, there's cross-examination. But certainly if we accept what he said, that he interpreted it to mean that he was fired because the investigation of the Russian connection to his campaign continued, then that clearly, in my judgment, falls into the domain of an impeachable offense. But these are the things I think that are important to understand. One, we still can get the Senate to subpoena the tapes that Trump says exist with regard to his conversations. Two, and this was during President Ford testified before the Congress on his pardon of Nixon, when there was suspicion there was a quid pro quo getting the White House in exchange for a pardon. So the Senate, in my judgment, or the House, could subpoena the president and say, you need to testify. And if you don't testify...
Is that a likely scenario?
It could be if the House tips to the Democrats in 2018. It is a very likely scenario. Now, in the Nixon case, when he refused to comply with House subpoenas, that was one of the articles of impeachment voted against him, because you're shutting down the ability to investigate an impeachable offense if the president is able to hide. And in this case, I said that is what is really needed. If we want to have all the facts, we need to have President Trump also up there, like Mr. Comey, testifying under oath what he thinks happened.
Let me quickly ask you about what the White House said yesterday, that President feels vindicated because Comey said he wasn't under investigation personally. Was it even appropriate for the director of the FBI to tell the President of the United States, you, sir, personally are not under investigation?
That's highly irregular. That is, the FBI ordinarily never tells anybody whether they're under investigation or not, because if they say yes, then they could take matters into evasion. And what about if you say no, but what if the things change the next day? Then you would feel compelled to disclose to the public, now he is under investigation. And ordinarily, you don't do that until somebody actually is charged with a crime. It stays secret. There can be all sorts of embarrassment. But I think Comey was human. I think one of the things that's impressive about his testimony this morning is he said, yeah, I maybe made mistakes. Yeah. I was under pressure. Now, that's the humility that we have never seen for a nanosecond out of the Oval Office.
He also said the Trump administration lied about me and the FBI, saying those were simple Those were lies, plain and simple, giving really the reasoning why he was fired. James Comey's testimony likely to go on for several more hours. Bruce Fein, thank you so much for your take.